Between 1970 and 1971, the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area experienced one of its darkest chapters. Over the course of 18 months, a predator moved through the streets and highways with terrifying precision. 6 young people disappeared. 6 families lost children they would never see again. The cases remained unsolved for decades, and the psychological impact rippled through an entire generation. This is the story of the Freeway Phantom, a series of killings that gripped a nation, challenged law enforcement, and raised questions about institutional failure, racism, and the cost of indifference when victims come from the wrong side of the tracks. What you're about to hear isn't sensationalism. It's documentation. It's remembrance. And it's a call for continued vigilance in a world where some cases never truly close. Before we dive into the details, I want to ask you to do something. Let me know where you're watching from in the comment section, and do not forget to subscribe to this channel. We cover cases like this with the respect they deserve, not for entertainment, but for education and for the memory of those who can no longer speak for themselves. Turn on notifications so you don't miss our next investigation. Your support helps us continue this work. Thank you. Now, let's go back to 1970. To understand the Freeway Phantom killings, you must first understand Washington, D.C. in 1970. The city was a place of profound contradiction and tension. On one hand, the nation's capital was experiencing unprecedented growth and development. The freeways that had been introduced in the 1960s represented progress, modernity, and connection. Interstate 95, the Washington Beltway, Route 50, these ribbons of concrete were supposed to bring the region together, to facilitate commerce, to modernize infrastructure. On the other hand, the city was profoundly segregated. Not by law. The Civil Rights Act had been passed 6 years prior. But segregation by economics, by zip code, and by the machinery of systemic inequality still very much defined where people lived, worked, and died. The city was approximately 70% African American by 1970, but African Americans held little political or economic power. Neighborhoods like Southeast D.C. and Northeast D.C. were predominantly black communities where poverty, unemployment, and limited opportunity were daily realities. These weren't random conditions. They were the direct result of redlining, discriminatory lending practices, and deliberate disinvestment by the federal government and private sector. The freeways themselves became symbols of this inequality. They were routed through black neighborhoods, destroying established communities, displacing families, and creating physical barriers. Meanwhile, wealthier, predominantly white areas were largely spared. In this environment of tension, frustration, and despair, the Freeway Phantom began to hunt. Let's talk about the police force in D.C. during this period. The Metropolitan Police Department, the MPD, was vast but understaffed relative to the city's size. Officers were often overworked, underpaid, and in many cases, indifferent to crimes that occurred in black neighborhoods. This isn't speculation. It's been documented by historians, journalists, and by the patterns of police response we can trace through these very cases. When crimes occurred in affluent white neighborhoods, resources were mobilized. When they occurred in Southeast or Northeast D.C., the response was often slower, less intensive, and less thorough. This institutional racism, and I use that term deliberately, will become a critical factor in the Freeway Phantom investigation, or rather, the failure of the investigation. By 1970, Washington, D.C. had experienced the riots of 1968 following Martin Luther King's assassination. Much of the city's commercial corridor along 14th Street and U Street had been damaged or destroyed. The city was still healing. Or rather, the city was experiencing the ongoing trauma of racial conflict and economic abandonment. It was into this powder keg that the Freeway Phantom emerged. The first victim we can definitively connect to in this series was Assunta Anta Esposito. But before we discuss her case, we need to talk about another case that preceded it, one that may or may not be connected, but which set the stage for everything that followed. In April 1970, two young girls disappeared in Southeast D.C. Their names were Carol Denise Spinks and Darla Jean Lewis. Denise was 16. Darla was 12. They were last seen at a shopping center in Southeast, and neither was ever found alive. Their bodies were discovered in a wooded area near Route 50, one of the freeways that cut through the region. The police investigation was minimal. There was no massive manhunt. There was no flood of resources. The girls were black. They were from poor families, and in the calculus of institutional priority, their cases didn't register the same way cases of white, middle-class victims would have. Their deaths largely faded from public consciousness. But looking back now, with the knowledge of everything that followed, we have to ask, were these the first victims of the Freeway Phantom, or were they killed by someone else entirely? The truth is, we may never know with certainty. The cases were never conclusively linked at the time, and evidence has been lost to time. What we can say is this: their disappearance and deaths established a pattern. Young people disappearing from the streets of D.C., and the system's indifference to their fate. Then came September 1970. Assunta Esposito was 14 years old. She lived in Southeast D.C. with her family. By most accounts, she was a typical teenager, concerned with school, with friends, with the normal preoccupations of adolescence. On September 25, 1970, Anta, as she was known, was walking home from school. She never arrived. Her family reported her missing. Search efforts began, but they were inadequate. The police response was slow. 5 days later, her body was discovered in a wooded area near a freeway. She had been brutalized, sexually assaulted, murdered. The medical examiner's report, which we can now examine decades later, indicated that she had been subjected to extreme violence. But details about her injuries were not widely publicized at the time. In fact, much of the investigation was kept from the public. The police withheld information, whether to avoid panic or protect investigative details. We're not entirely sure. What we know is this: Anta's murder shocked her community, but it did not shock the broader city. For most white Washingtonians, the killing of a young black girl from Southeast D.C. was a tragedy, certainly, but not an existential threat. It was something that happened in those neighborhoods. The police investigation into Anta's death, by all accounts, was cursory. There was no public information campaign. There were no appeals for witnesses with the kind of urgency that might have been deployed for a different victim. The case generated minimal media coverage. Anta Esposito was murdered, and the city moved on. But the killer didn't move on. He was just getting started. In October 1970, just weeks after Anta's body was discovered, another girl disappeared. Her name was Dorothy Jolly. She was 16 years old. Dorothy disappeared from Southeast D.C. on October 1st, 1970. Like Anta, she was last seen walking in her neighborhood. Like Anta, she never arrived at her destination. Her body was found in a wooded area in Maryland, near the Washington Beltway. She, too, had been murdered. She, too, had been sexually assaulted. Now we had 2 deaths, 2 young black girls, 2 unsolved murders, and a pattern is beginning to emerge. The police department began to take note. Not all of them took it seriously. The institutional indifference remained, but investigators assigned to the case began to recognize that something systematic might be happening. Detectives working the homicide division started comparing notes. They began to hypothesize that a single perpetrator might be responsible for multiple killings. The term serial killer wasn't commonly used in law enforcement at that time the way it is today, but the understanding of a pattern predator was beginning to crystallize. November 1970 came. Then November became December. The holiday season approached. Families prepared for Thanksgiving and Christmas. And then, in December 1970, a third girl disappeared. Her name was Brenda Woodard. She was 18 years old. Unlike the previous victims, Brenda was not simply walking home from school. She was living a more precarious existence. She had been in and out of the foster care system. She was staying with different people, sleeping in different places. She was, in the language of that era, and this one, vulnerable. Brenda disappeared from Southeast D.C. on December 24th, 1970, Christmas Eve. On Christmas Day, while families opened presents and celebrated together, Brenda Woodard's body was discovered near the Washington Beltway. She had been murdered. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been dumped like garbage. Now we had 3 victims in 4 months. 3 young black women. 3 bodies discovered near freeways. 3 families were destroyed. And still, the broader media and public response was muted. There were articles in the local papers. D.C.'s black newspapers, particularly the Washington Afro-American, covered the killings more thoroughly. But in the national media, in the mainstream press, the story barely registered. Can you imagine if these were 3 white girls from upper-middle-class neighborhoods in Arlington or Bethesda? The response would have been entirely different. National news programs would have run extensive coverage. Federal resources would have been mobilized. There would have been sustained intense pressure on law enforcement. But these were black girls from poor neighborhoods in Southeast D.C. The indifference was real, and it was institutional. Still, the murders continued. In January 1971, another girl disappeared. Her name was Darlene Craven. She was 19 years old. And in March 1971, Brenda Denise Crockett, who was 13 years old, disappeared from her Southeast D.C. neighborhood. Both girls' bodies were discovered near freeways. Both had been murdered. Both had been sexually assaulted. By spring of 1971, we had 6 confirmed victims, possibly 7 or 8 if you count the earlier cases that may or may not have been connected. 6 confirmed victims in a metropolitan area of over 2 million people. A predator moving through the night, killing, dumping bodies, vanishing. The investigation was ongoing, but it was hampered by numerous factors: inadequate resources, institutional racism within the police department, jurisdictional issues. Some murders occurred in D.C. proper, others in Maryland or Virginia, and the killer's apparent cunning in victim selection and disposal. The killer, it became clear, was targeting vulnerable young people, runaways, foster kids, young people living on the margins, young people who were less likely to be immediately missed, young people whose disappearances might take time to be reported. And virtually all the victims were black. This last detail is crucial. Whether the killer's choice was motivated by racism or simply by opportunity, by the understanding that the police cared less about black victims, it meant that entire communities were being targeted. By mid-1971, the police department had formed a special task force to investigate the Freeway Phantom killings. This was significant. It acknowledged that a serious problem existed. It allocated dedicated resources to the investigation. But the task force faced enormous challenges. Evidence was limited. There were no clear leads. The killer had left no obvious fingerprints, no semen samples that could be analyzed with the primitive DNA techniques that existed at the time, no witnesses who could provide a clear description. The killer was, in a very real sense, invisible. Police conducted extensive interviews. They canvassed neighborhoods. They checked suspicious persons. They followed up on leads, most of which led nowhere. The investigation consumed an enormous amount of time and resources, but produced no arrests. By the end of 1971, the killings seemed to stop. No new victims were reported. The killer disappeared, either by leaving the area, by being incarcerated for other crimes, or simply by ceasing his activities. The police had no answers, but at least there were no more bodies. We've mentioned the victims by name and age, but we must do more than that. We must see them as individuals, as people with lives, with families, with potential that was cut short. To treat them merely as case numbers or as data points in a serial killer investigation is to participate in the same dehumanization that facilitated their murders in the first place. Let's go back. Let's spend time with each of these individuals and understand their lives and their deaths with the dignity they deserve. Assunta Esposito. Assunta Esposito, known as Antad to her family and friends, was born in 1956. She lived with her family in Southeast D.C., in a neighborhood that was working class and poor, but which had community connections and family bonds. By all accounts, Antad was a bright student. She attended school regularly and had hopes for her future. She was living in circumstances that limited her opportunities, but she was not without hope. On September 25th, 1970, at 14 years old, she set out to walk home from school. It was a regular day. Nothing seemed unusual. She was probably thinking about homework, about what she'd have for dinner, about the normal things teenagers think about. She never made it home. Her family reported her missing. Days passed. Then came the discovery of her body in a wooded area near Route 50. The medical examiner determined that she had been sexually assaulted and murdered. Antad Esposito never had the chance to graduate high school. She never had the chance to fall in love, to develop her talents, to contribute to the world in whatever way she might have. She was 14 years old, and she was erased. Her killer was never found. Dorothy Jolly. Dorothy Jolly was 16. She lived in Southeast D.C., not far from where Antad had lived. Like Antad, she was a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. On October 1st, 1970, Dorothy disappeared. Her body was found in Maryland, near the Beltway. She had been murdered. The details of her death, preserved in police records and medical examiner reports, tell a story of violence and degradation. But Dorothy's life, the person she was, her dreams, her relationships, her potential, those details are more obscure. The historical record captured the method of her death far better than the substance of her life. What we know is that she mattered. She was somebody's daughter, somebody's friend, and she was stolen. Brenda Woodard. Brenda Woodard was 18 years old. Unlike the other victims, Brenda's life before her death was more visibly precarious. She had been in and out of foster care. She had experienced instability, abandonment, and the vulnerabilities that come with being young and unsheltered in a major city. Brenda was also, by multiple accounts, a sex worker. She was surviving on the streets in ways that other teenagers were not. This doesn't make her death less tragic. It makes it more so. It puts her in a category of individuals whom society has already abandoned, whom the police care less about, whom the systems designed to protect are failing. In December 1970, Brenda disappeared. Her body was found near the Washington Beltway, on Christmas Day. Think about that. On the day when Americans gather with family to celebrate, a young woman was lying dead in the woods, the victim of a predator who had selected her because she was vulnerable and because no one powerful enough to care was watching. Brenda Woodard deserved better. She was human. She deserved protection, opportunity, and a future. Darlene Craven. Darlene Craven was 19. She, too, lived in Southeast D.C. Like the others, she was young, she was black, she was poor, and she was vulnerable. In January 1971, Darlene disappeared. Her body was found near the freeways that had carved up her neighborhood. Brenda Denise Crockett was 13 years old. She was the youngest of the confirmed victims. A child, really, 13, still developing, still becoming, still with decades of life ahead of her. In March 1971, she disappeared from Southeast D.C. Her body was found near the freeways. The others, we've been discussing 6 confirmed victims. But there were others, young people who disappeared during this period, whose cases may or may not have been connected to Freeway Phantom, but whose deaths formed part of the landscape of violence that defined 1970 to 71 in Washington, D.C. Carol Denise Spinks and Darla Jean Lewis, whom we mentioned earlier, disappeared in April 1970. They were not officially connected to the Freeway Phantom case at the time, but their deaths occurred during the same period and followed similar patterns. There were other cases too. Disappearances, murders, young people who simply vanished and were never fully investigated. The institutional indifference of the era means that we will never know, with certainty, how many victims should actually be attributed to the Freeway Phantom. But at minimum, we're talking about 6 confirmed cases. 6 young people, all black, all from poor neighborhoods, all vulnerable, all dead. The investigation into the Freeway Phantom killings was, from the beginning, hampered by numerous challenges. Let's examine those challenges in detail, because they tell us something important about the systems that were supposed to protect vulnerable people and, instead, failed them catastrophically. Challenge number 1, institutional racism. The Metropolitan Police Department in 1970 to 71 was a segregated institution in practice, if not in policy. While the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had nominally ended segregation, the MPD was still dominated by white officers from working-class and middle-class backgrounds. Many of these officers brought with them the prejudices and indifferences of their era. When crimes occurred in white neighborhoods, resources were mobilized quickly. When they occurred in black neighborhoods, the response was slower, less intensive, and less thorough. This wasn't paranoia or speculation. It was a documented pattern that emerged when researchers later examined police response times, allocation of detective resources, and the intensity of investigations. Moreover, many white officers simply didn't view crimes in black neighborhoods as priorities. This was not always conscious racism, though some of it certainly was. Often it was more subtle. It was an assumption that black communities had higher crime rates anyway, that violence was somehow more endemic to black neighborhoods, that therefore individual cases might be less significant. This institutional racism meant that when Antaya Esposito disappeared, there was no Amber Alert system. Those didn't exist yet. But there was also no massive mobilization of resources. When Dorothy Jolly's body was found, detectives assigned to the case were not given unlimited resources to pursue every lead. When Brenda Woodard was murdered, the investigation proceeded slowly, methodically, but without the urgency that might have been applied to victims from wealthier, whiter neighborhoods. Challenge number 2, jurisdictional issues. The killings occurred across multiple jurisdictions. Some occurred in Washington, D.C. proper. Some occurred in Maryland. Some possibly occurred in Virginia. This meant that the investigation had to involve multiple police departments: the D.C. Police, the Maryland State Police, local county police. Coordination between jurisdictions was inadequate by today's standards, and it was even more inadequate in 1971. Information didn't flow easily. Resources weren't easily shared. Detectives from different jurisdictions sometimes didn't communicate effectively. In a modern investigation, a task force might be formed immediately when a pattern became apparent. In 1971, it took months for authorities to even acknowledge that the cases were likely connected. Challenge number 3: limited forensic technology. By today's standards, the forensic tools available to investigators in 1970 to 71 seem impossibly primitive. DNA analysis didn't exist. Fingerprint analysis was possible, but it required clear, full prints, and in most of these cases, the crime scenes were in wooded areas where such evidence wasn't readily available or easily preserved. There was no sophisticated trace evidence analysis. There was no computer database of known offenders that could be searched across jurisdictions. If there had been, it's possible that the perpetrator might have been identified, assuming he had a prior criminal record. Interviews had to be conducted manually. Information had to be recorded by hand or typed. Cross-referencing data across different cases and jurisdictions was a tedious, time-consuming process. What this meant in practical terms was that the investigators were working with their hands tied behind their backs. Even if they had brought maximum resources and focus to the case, the tools available to them were limited. Despite these challenges, the investigation did proceed. By early 1971, the D.C. Police Department had assembled a task force to focus on the killings. The task force included detectives from a homicide division and investigators with experience in serial crime. One of the key figures in the investigation was a detective named Roy Whitcomb. Whitcomb was a white detective who, by the accounts we have from historical sources, took the case seriously. He believed that the killings were connected. He believed that the perpetrator was likely a serial killer. He advocated for resources to investigate the cases thoroughly. There was also Detective Melvin Ely, an African-American detective who was assigned to the case and who worked closely with the task force. These investigators, despite the institutional limitations they faced, pursued leads. They interviewed hundreds of suspects and potential witnesses. They reviewed police records to identify individuals with histories of violence against women. They coordinated with other police departments. They consulted with forensic experts. But despite all this effort, they had almost nothing to work with. The killer had left almost no physical evidence. There were no clear eyewitnesses. The crime scenes offered minimal clues. The killer seemed to select victims in a way that minimized the likelihood of detection. Some of the victims were reported missing by family members relatively quickly. In other cases, days or weeks passed before disappearances were officially reported. This meant that any evidence at the scene of disappearance, if there had been seen, had long since been disturbed or destroyed. The bodies, when discovered, had been exposed to the elements for periods ranging from days to weeks. This meant that sexual assault evidence was often degraded or absent. Fingerprints were destroyed. Forensic analysis was hindered. In short, the killer had either remarkable luck, remarkable skill, or some combination of the two. He understood, whether consciously or intuitively, how to commit these murders and dispose of the bodies in ways that left minimal evidence. By summer 1971, the killings seemed to have stopped. No new victims were reported. The last confirmed victim was Brenda Denise Crockett in March 1971. After that, there were no more disappearances that fit the pattern. The investigators had several working hypotheses. One, the perpetrator had left the area. He might have moved to another city, another state. Serial killers have been known to migrate, to establish patterns in different jurisdictions. Two, the perpetrator had been incarcerated. He might have committed some other crime and been sent to prison, where he was unable to continue his killing. Three, the perpetrator had died. He might have been killed or died of natural causes. Four, the perpetrator had simply stopped. For whatever reason, psychological, circumstantial, the compulsion to kill had ceased. All of these were possible. Without a suspect, without an arrest, there was no way to know which was true. The investigation continued throughout 1971 and into 1972, but with gradually decreasing intensity. As months passed without new victims, the sense of urgency faded. The task force was eventually disbanded or redirected to other cases. The Freeway Phantom became one of many unsolved murders in the D.C. Police Department's cold case files. The cases were never closed, but they were effectively abandoned. For the families of the victims, this meant living with uncertainty. They didn't know who had killed their daughters and siblings. They didn't know if the killer was still alive, still a threat. They didn't have closure. For the broader community, the black residents of Southeast and Northeast D.C., the unsolved murders sent a clear message. Your lives don't matter. Your deaths won't be avenged. The system isn't designed to protect you. This message, repeated through decades of indifference and institutional racism, had profound psychological and social effects. Over the decades, as the cases remained unsolved, various theories emerged about the identity of the Freeway Phantom. Some were based on genuine investigative work. Others were speculation. Some bordered on conspiracy theory. Let's examine the most credible theories and consider what evidence, if any, supports them. Theory 1. The serial killer active in the region. Various serial killers were active in the Washington, D.C. area during the late 1960s and 1970s. When the Freeway Phantom killings remained unsolved, investigators naturally wondered whether a known serial killer might be responsible. One individual who came under suspicion was Gary Heidnik, a serial killer who operated primarily in Philadelphia but who had connections to the Washington, D.C. area. Heidnik kidnapped, imprisoned, and murdered young women, many of them black. However, the timeline and the modus operandi didn't quite fit. Heidnik's documented activities began later than the Freeway Phantom killings. While it's theoretically possible that he could have been responsible, there's no solid evidence connecting him to the D.C. cases. Another suspect was Edmund Kemper, a California-based serial killer. But again, the geography and timeline didn't support this theory. Theory 2. The truck driver. One theory that emerged early in the investigation suggested that the perpetrator might be a truck driver or someone with regular access to vehicles, given that many of the victims' bodies were found near highways and that transportation would have been necessary to move the bodies. Investigators pursued this angle, interviewing truck drivers and individuals with relevant access and opportunity. But no solid suspect emerged from this line of inquiry. Theory 3. The police officer. Another theory suggested that the perpetrator might be a police officer or someone with some affiliation with law enforcement. This theory was based partly on the assumption that the killer possessed knowledge about police procedures and how to avoid detection. While it's theoretically possible, there's no evidence that supports this theory. It remains, at best, speculation. One of the more interesting theories involves a man named Freddie Grant. Grant was a known pedophile and sex offender who was arrested in the D.C. area in the early 1970s. Grant fit the geographic profile. He was known to frequent the same neighborhoods where the victims disappeared. He had a history of violence against young women, and he was active during the exact period of the killings. Moreover, Grant was incarcerated in 1971, which would explain why the killings stopped around that time. Some investigators and researchers have theorized that Grant was the Freeway Phantom. But here's the problem. There's no definitive evidence. Grant was never charged in connection with any of the Freeway Phantom cases. His conviction was for other crimes. Without DNA evidence or other forensic proof, linking him to the murders would be speculative. That said, Grant remains one of the more plausible suspects, and there are researchers and investigators who believe he was responsible. One fascinating aspect of the Freeway Phantom case is that after 1971, the killings appear to have stopped. No new victims were reported. The pattern that had been so clear for 18 months simply ceased. This could mean several things. If the perpetrator was indeed Freddie Grant, then his incarceration would explain the cessation of murders. He couldn't kill while in prison. If the perpetrator was someone else, he might have fled the area, died, intentionally stopped, been incarcerated for an unrelated crime. Some researchers have speculated that the intensive police investigation and media attention in mid-1971 might have made the perpetrator cautious. He might have decided that continuing to kill risked capture. He might have gone dark, ceasing his activities while remaining in the area. This is speculative, of course, but it's a plausible theory, given what we know about serial killer behavior. Some serial killers do stop killing, and then resume years or even decades later. Others stop permanently. One of the most significant effects of the unsolved Freeway Phantom murders is the uncertainty that has persisted for decades. Families of the victims lived not knowing who killed their loved ones. Potential witnesses lived not knowing whether they possessed information that could have solved the case. And the broader community, the black residents of D.C. who were the implicit targets of this predator, lived with the knowledge that there was a killer in their midst and that the system had failed to catch him. This uncertainty has psychological effects. It perpetuates trauma. It prevents closure. It raises questions about whether there's a statute of limitations on public accountability. As we examine the Freeway Phantom case in hindsight, certain institutional failures become apparent. These aren't matters of speculation. They're documented by the historical record and by the testimony of investigators and researchers who have studied these cases. Failure 1, racist triage. The first and most glaring institutional failure was a racist prioritization of cases based on race and socioeconomic status of victims. When the first victim, Antaz Esposito, was reported missing, the police response was inadequate. If she had been a 14-year-old white girl from a middle-class family in Northwest D.C., the response would have been different. There would have been police on the streets. There would have been media attention. There would have been an urgent search. Instead, because Antaz was a poor black girl from Southeast D.C., the system treated her case as less urgent. By the time the second and third victims were discovered, it was becoming clear that something systematic was happening. But even then, the response from white leadership and white institutions was measured. The case didn't receive the level of resources, attention, or political pressure it deserved. This wasn't accidental. It was systemic. It reflected the values of the institutions involved and the society that funded them. Failure 2, inadequate resources. The task force that was eventually formed to investigate the Freeway Phantom murders was assembled late, not until well into the series of killings. And even when it was formed, it operated with limited resources. By today's standards, this would be unthinkable. A serial killer murdering young people in a major metropolitan area would trigger an immediate, massive response. The FBI would be called in. Federal resources would be mobilized. Media attention would be intense. In 1971, the response was more modest. This wasn't entirely due to racism, though racism played a role. It was also partly due to the technology and institutional knowledge available at the time. Serial murder as a category of crime wasn't as well understood. Law enforcement's response protocols were less developed. Still, more could have been done. More resources could have been allocated. The investigation could have been treated with greater urgency. Failure 3. Poor coordination. The jurisdictional issues that hampered the investigation reflected poor coordination and communication among police departments. In a modern case, a task force would have been immediately formed involving all relevant jurisdictions. Information would have been shared in real time. Resources would have been coordinated. In 1971, this didn't happen effectively. It took time for investigators to even acknowledge that the cases were connected. Once they did, coordination between D.C. Police, Maryland State Police, and local county police was inadequate. Better coordination might not have solved the case, but it would have given investigators the best possible chance of doing so. Failure 4. Inadequate victim support. The families of the victims were left largely to cope with their losses alone. There was no victim support system in place. There were no counselors, no community resources, no official channel for families to receive information about the investigation or to provide information themselves. This seems almost unimaginable today. Modern police departments have victim advocates. They have systems in place to keep families informed and to provide emotional support. In 1970 to 71, this didn't exist. The result was that families of the Freeway Phantom victims were doubly victimized, first by the loss of their loved ones, and second by the indifference and neglect of institutions that were supposed to serve them. Failure 5. Media neglect. The mainstream media in 1970 to 71 largely ignored the Freeway Phantom killings. If you picked up the Washington Post, if you watched the evening news, the story barely registered. This wasn't an accident. It was a reflection of editorial decisions about what was newsworthy and what wasn't. Killings in black neighborhoods were less newsworthy than killings in white neighborhoods. Poor victims were less newsworthy than wealthy victims. The deaths of young black women from Southeast D.C. were deemed less interesting, less important, less worthy of sustained coverage than the deaths of white, middle-class victims would have been. This media neglect had real consequences. It meant that the public wasn't mobilized to help the investigation. It meant that potential witnesses didn't see appeals for information. It meant that the broader city wasn't forced to confront what was happening in its own neighborhoods. The black press, publications like the Washington Afro-American, did cover the cases more thoroughly, but the reach of the black press was limited, and it couldn't mobilize the same level of institutional resources as the mainstream media. To truly understand the Freeway Phantom murders, we must understand them not in isolation, but as part of a broader pattern of violence and institutional failure that characterized the late 1960s and early 1970s in American cities. The era of serial murder. The late 1960s and 1970s are often referred to as the golden age of serial murder in America. This isn't because there were more serial killers than before, though there may have been, but because a particular set of social, technological, and institutional factors converged to create conditions in which serial killers could operate with relative impunity. Urban mobility had increased dramatically. Highways had proliferated. People moved between cities and states with greater ease. This mobility was celebrated as progress, as freedom, but it also meant that a predator could move between jurisdictions, leaving behind a trail of bodies that local police had difficulty connecting to a single perpetrator. At the same time, forensic technology was primitive. There was no national computer database of suspects. There was no FBI profiling unit, at least not in the form it would take later. Communication between police departments was slow and cumbersome. It was, in many ways, a perfect storm for serial killers. And America paid a terrible price, with victims numbering in the hundreds or thousands. One crucial pattern in the Freeway Phantom murders, and in many serial killings of this era, was a deliberate selection of vulnerable victims. The perpetrator chose young people. He chose black victims from poor neighborhoods. He chose people who were already marginalized, already on periphery of society, already treated as disposable by the institutions supposedly designed to protect them. This wasn't random. It was calculated. A serial killer who understands that the police care less about victims of a certain race or socioeconomic status will deliberately target those victims. The killer can operate with greater freedom, knowing that resources won't be mobilized the way they would be for a different category of victim. This is a crucial insight. Serial killers don't exist in a vacuum. They operate within a social context. When that social context is characterized by racism and class indifference, it creates conditions in which serial killers can flourish. In this sense, the institutional racism of the D.C., the police department wasn't separate from the Freeway Phantom murders. It was implicated in them. It was part of the environment that allowed the killer to continue operating. We've mentioned the freeways multiple times. The victims' bodies were discovered near Interstate 95, the Washington Beltway, and Route 50. But the freeways aren't just incidental to this story. They're central to it. As we discussed earlier, the freeways have been routed through black neighborhoods, destroying established communities and creating physical barriers. They have been celebrated as progress, as modernization, but they had also been instruments of urban destruction. In a darkly symbolic way, the freeways became a location where the bodies of murdered young people were disposed. The same infrastructure that had destroyed black communities in the name of progress became the final resting place of those communities' murdered members. There's something deeply troubling about this symbolism. It suggests that the violence wasn't just interpersonal, a predator killing victims, but structural. The society itself, through its institutions and infrastructure, was participating in violence against a vulnerable population. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Freeway Phantom murders was the silence that surrounded them. In a functioning society, the murder of 6 young people in 18 months would have triggered a profound social response. There would have been community outrage. There would have been media coverage. There would have been political pressure. There would have been public grief. But there wasn't. Or at least, there wasn't much. Yes, the black community of D.C. was grieving. Yes, the families of the victims were devastated. Yes, some journalists and investigators took the case seriously. But for much of white Washington, for much of the mainstream institutional apparatus, the murders simply didn't register as particularly significant. They were tragic, certainly, but they weren't an emergency. They weren't the kind of crimes that mobilized the public and the institutions. This silence itself was a form of violence. It was a form of institutional indifference. It was a form of dehumanization. The Freeway Phantom case went cold for decades. The murders occurred in 1970 to 71, and the investigation had largely stalled by 1972. For the next 30 years, there was almost no public movement, no new investigations, no significant developments. Then, In the early 2000s, things began to change. By the 2000s, DNA analysis had become a reliable tool in criminal investigations. It was now possible to extract DNA from crime scenes and bodies that hadn't been analyzed decades earlier. Cold cases that seemed permanently unsolved could be revisited. The D.C. Police Department, prompted by national trends and by pressure from victim advocacy groups, began to revisit cold cases. Evidence from the Freeway Phantom murders was re-examined. DNA analysis was performed on evidence that had been preserved. Some results were promising. DNA from evidence at some of the crime scenes was successfully extracted. This DNA could potentially be used to identify the perpetrator, if he was in the National DNA Database, or if he was ever arrested and his DNA was added to the database. But there was a significant problem. The perpetrator was never identified. Either his DNA wasn't in the database, or he was never caught and processed, or the DNA evidence wasn't sufficiently clear to make a definitive match. Another factor in the revival of interest in the case was the emergence of a new generation of investigators and journalists who were interested in cold cases. Television programs devoted to unsolved murders became popular. The documentary form, both on television and online, created opportunities to revisit old cases with fresh perspective and modern tools. Authors and researchers began to investigate the Freeway Phantom case. They interviewed surviving family members. They reviewed archived police records. They examined newspaper articles from the era. They consulted with forensic experts and criminologists. Some of this research has been rigorous and valuable. It has shed new light on the case. It has kept the memory of the victims alive. It has preserved details that might otherwise have been lost. As DNA analysis and renewed investigations began in the 2000s, one name that continued to surface was Freddie Grant. Grant had been a convicted sex offender active in the D.C. area during the time of the murders. He had been incarcerated beginning in 1971. Some investigators and researchers became convinced that he was the Freeway Phantom. The case for Grant is circumstantial but suggestive. 1. He was active in the right place at the right time. He was known to frequent the neighborhoods where the victims disappeared. 2. He had a history of violence against young women and children. 3. He was incarcerated in 1971, which aligns with the cessation of the Freeway Phantom killings. 4. Other serial killers and sex offenders from that era have been conclusively connected to murders decades later through DNA analysis. It's plausible that Grant could be connected to the Freeway Phantom murders through similar means. However, there has been no definitive proof. DNA analysis either hasn't been performed or hasn't produced a conclusive match. Without such proof, Grant remains a theory, not an established fact. Freddie Grant died in prison in the 1990s, so he was never prosecuted for Freeway Phantom murders. Whether he was guilty or innocent may never be conclusively established. To this day, the Freeway Phantom murders remain officially unsolved. No one has been charged. No one has been convicted. The families of the victims remain without closure. Some investigators believe they know who the perpetrator was. Others believe new evidence or new investigative techniques might eventually solve the case. Still others believe the truth will never be known. What is certain is that 6 young people are dead, their lives cut short by violence. Their families are grieving. Their communities have been affected, and the institutions that were supposed to protect them failed.